What heals narcissism? Modern psychology got off to a bad start in addressing this question when the early psychoanalysts about 100 years ago believed that it was untreatable. I don't find this to be true. I would agree, however, that its healing is not an easy fix. And that can be seen when we consider this. Within a year of its discovery, clever humans developed efficacious vaccines for the corona-19 virus. Yet the social virus of narcissism was discovered over 2 millennia ago, yet it's as rampant today as ever. For this reason alone, narcissism has been badly in need of a revisioning. Narcissism is arguably the first recognized personality disorder. Greek and then Roman poets were writing about it between 2,000 and 3,500 years ago. These poets gave us many different versions of the myth of Narcissus and Echo, from which narcissism was first named. The early Greeks had also recognized narcissism's hubris, a prideful arrogance that transgresses rightful bounds. They viewed hubris both as a civic crime against other citizens, as well as a spiritual crime, a crime against the gods. Perhaps for both reasons, they also saw hubris as the central character flaw in the protagonists of ancient Greek tragic dramas. In fact, they saw hubris all over the place, much as we're starting to see narcissism now. Narcissism may not only be the earliest recognized personality disorder, it may also reflect the earliest wound in the soul, what has been termed the narcissistic wound, the wounding that happens when the soul's essential nature, our very being, is not adequately recognized and empathically supported. Then our sense of world becomes oblivious and unwelcoming, and we can become oblivious to the enoughness of our own underlying being. This wounded sense of self, this wounding sense of world, this wounded dyad of self and other may also be the most challenging wound to heal. For all its current reliance on psychopharmacology, psychiatry never has and never will find a magic pill to eradicate it. And speaking of psychiatry, it made another unfortunate move also early in the 20th century, when modern psychology was first trying to establish itself as a legitimate medical and scientific discipline. For in the attempt to better establish its own credibility, it divorced itself from its close cousins, the world's spiritual and religious traditions, and the limiting impact of the early divorce still lingers in the mainstream of modern psychology. This spiritual divorce is culturally understandable if we consider the kind of religiosity and spirituality prevailing in early 20th century Europe. Much of it was exoteric dogma and in need of a reformation. But the early psychoanalysts couldn't provide it. Instead, they threw the baby out along with the bathwater. For Freud viewed religion in a similar light as Karl Marx's notion of an opiate of the masses. In his 1927 work, The Future of an Illusion, Freud reduced any apprehension of God to an illusory outgrowth of an Oedipal complex, and as mankind's attempt to reconnect with a missing father. Elsewhere, he linked Jewish guilt to a murdered father from long ago, the alleged murder of Moses, which today sounds no more plausible than Freud's belief that all sons bear a universal, unconscious death wish for their fathers, or Trump's conspiracy theory linking the assassination of JFK to the father of his one-time opponent, Ted Cruz. In truth, Freud hated his father for much of his life, and it led him to misread the story of Oedipus. For a closer reading reveals that it was actually the father and not the son who bore a murderous intent toward the other. For at the very beginning of the story, King Laius instructed that his just-born son should have his feet pinned together and then be left on a hillside to die. From this brutal event, Oedipus gets his name, which means swollen foot. And as the story unfolds, Oedipus is rescued from the hillside and raised by another couple that he assumes are his real parents. Years pass, and then it was actually an arrogant old man, King Laius, who initiates the fatal duel between father and son, when King Laius tries to run Oedipus off the road with his chariot. And Oedipus is only on that road in the first place, out of his desire to protect his father, for he has just heard of the prophecy of the Delphic oracle that he would kill his father and marry his mother. But back to Freud. Given the centrality of Freud's sexual theory, he also found religion as perpetuating sexual repression, as repression was the bane of that age, much as narcissism is for ours. And like Freud, most of the early psychoanalysts have been trained as medical doctors. Theirs was to be a psychology whose healing mantra was Freud's maxim, "Where id is, there shall ego be." But this ascension of egoic primacy ran counter to the intent of the world's religious and spiritual traditions, which has always been to dethrone the kingship of the ego. And it wasn't much help for treating narcissism, for we're less apt to discover methods of healing something if our operating premise is that it isn't healable in the first place. When psychology turned its back on religion and spirituality, for whatever credibility it may have gained, and for whatever patina of modernity it became cloaked by, it also lost access to the varied skillful means that the world's spiritual traditions had cultivated over millennia. And without them, narcissism may not be fully treatable. But the good news is there are actually quite a number of things that can help us heal from narcissism. The first step is to quit believing that narcissism only applies to those people or that public figure, or that the myth standing behind it is not really about us. Cultures themselves can suffer from narcissism. And then we have a type of narcissism unmentioned by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. What we might term cultural narcissism, or the narcissism of everyday life. For when it's become culturally normative, narcissism becomes harder to recognize and is thus underreported. Perhaps this is why the two most recent editions of the DSM, the official manual of American psychiatry, had estimated that the prevalence of narcissism in the American population could be as low as 0% at the low end of its estimate, and no more than 6.2% at the high end. Yet for decades, these estimates haven't reflected what many psychotherapists have found showing up in their consulting rooms, and another reason why narcissism has been badly in need of a revisioning. Cultures can have their own ways of self-idealizing, their own ways of feeling entitled, their own lack of empathy, and ways of transgressing rightful bounds. America, for example, has historically prided itself as being the land of the free and the home of the brave, a nation where all are ostensibly equal under the rule of law, and where all are to enjoy the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But beneath that self-idealization in its domestic policies, America also felt entitled to the lands of its native peoples, waged decades of Indian wars to gain their lands, and forced its native peoples onto reservations. America also condoned slavery into the latter third of the 19th century and still has a major political party trying to restrict the voting rights of people of color. In its international relations, America also felt entitled to effect regime change in other countries, as happened in Iran in 1953 and Iraq in 2003. In both cases, access to the Middle East's oil reserves were viewed as an American national security issue. This is what led the CIA to depose Iran's democratically elected leader in 1953 when he threatened to nationalize his own country's oil reserves. More recently, and also due in part to oil, the U.S. had also a somewhat dark partnership with Saudi Arabia, and so, for nearly 7 decades, the Middle East had become the nemesis to America's hubris, a region fraught with unintended consequences. The mention just made of nemesis bears further amplification, for the ancient Greeks considered that narcissism's hubris inevitably gives rise to a countering force, what they termed nemesis. Mythically, nemesis was iconographically often portrayed as an avenging goddess who punished those who had succumbed to the crime of hubris, and she was thought to have a keen, exacting sense of proportion. And iconographically, this is where she was often depicted holding a scale or a measuring rod in one hand and a sword in the other. With her measuring devices, she could determine those who had violated rightful bounds and proportions, and with her sword, she'd inevitably punish them. With nemesis in mind, we might revision American history and note that America has been involved in some form of warfare for every decade since its founding, and has spent more on armaments than the other 8 or 10 most heavily armed countries combined. So note the sense of proportion here. Ben Franklin warned of a coming danger likely to follow from adopting the martial eagle as our national bird, the same insignia as the Roman legion. Franklin thus argued for the turkey instead. Franklin's warning turned out to be prescient, for there's been a price to pay, a mythic comeuppance for the hubris of an American exceptionalism that conceives of itself as the most exalted nation in the history of the world, that shining city on the hill, a militant power whose underlying rhetorical chant has variously been not only "Don't tread on me," which first appeared on a flag at the nation's inception, along with a rattlesnake poised to strike, but "We're number one, we're number one," or more lately, "America first." Such a stance is also in need of a revisioning, for it's become increasingly unwieldy in a global world where the needs of all nations are interdependent, and a less ethnocentric awareness of this interdependence will be necessary in order to eradicate pandemics as well as to address the urgencies of climate change. The universe seems to be trying to teach us something. And like Nemesis, it will continue to pursue us with a karmic metaphorical sword when we fail to find the right proportional balance between self and other, and the ever-shifting rightful balance on the scales measuring ethnocentric and world-centric needs. That is, a proper balance between our own real needs as a nation, as distinct from the needs of a militant, grandiose, overreaching nationalism on the one hand, and a callous failure to exert the full impact of American power to more justly address the needs of the world on the other. And a question to ponder is, in what ways does this national entitlement, this militant, self-centered lack of empathy, and this sense of being exceptionally special play out in our individual American lives today? I'd suggest that narcissism can just be in the ether of a time or place, and like the air we breathe, hard to see. Different cultural epochs, or even different locales within the same culture, may be more narcissistic than others, and today, the prevailing tendency of recognizing narcissism only in others may be a case of the pot calling the kettle black, for there are statistics not reported by the DSM that suggest most of us Americans now have a bit of char in our pot. So, what can help us to heal from our personal and collective narcissism? This question is so large that its multiple answers are unlikely to come from a single source or from a single moment in time. It may be one of those questions that profits from our walking around with it for a while. And since I've been doing that for several years now, I'd like to suggest a few healing heresies. Though it may sound heretical to a psychological orthodoxy, one that has underexplored spiritual practices for the past century, my own personal and clinical experience has been that it really helps to have some form of daily meditation practice, a time in each day when we cease promoting or defending our self-image. For in truth, who and what we really are is not our self-image. Conflating our identity with the self-image is actually a central confusion of narcissism itself. Yet we live in a culture where the advertising industry is telling us that our image is everything, and where so many of us now are self-absorbed by the reflections given by our cell phones. How many likes did I get today? How many new friends on Facebook? Oh, the horrors of being ghosted, unfriended, or when someone unsubscribes from the minutia we post. If my parents, boyfriend, or girlfriend don't really get me, maybe the search engines will. Am I trending, or just another unrecognized, exceptional person? So, rather than an image of self, any image of self, it's better to cultivate what's been termed presence. And there are countless practices that can help us to do this. One is the exercise of sensing. Here, you literally come to your senses. For example, by listening to the sounds of the present moment in the objective way a tape recorder would listen, with no filtering, interpretation, or rebuttal. Remember, it's not really all about you. Try to hear the world speak in its own terms. Then, do the same with your visual sense, viewing the present moment the way a video camera might, just seeing everything nakedly, freshly, as if for the first time, and not as the same old, same old. And then you add your kinesthetic sense, sensing your arms and legs, and the sensations and feelings of your body. Unless we're hallucinating, our sensory perceptions of the world are not coming from the past or future. And so they can anchor us in the fullness of our own presence, where nothing is lacking and nothing in excess. There are also countless gazing practices that humans have employed throughout time in the attempt to counter narcissism's egocentric vision. In Ovid's version of the myth of Narcissus and Echo, such a transformational gaze occurs. In fact, it's the pivotal image in the myth. Near the beginning of Ovid's rendition, the concerned mother of Narcissus is told by Tiresias, the archetypal seer of the Greek mythopoeic world, that her son would live to a ripe old age, provided that he never comes to know himself, for surely that would lead to his death. Then, near the conclusion of the myth, a still youthful Narcissus comes upon a strange pool of water. Ovid tells us that this pool doesn't reflect ordinary things like shepherds, goats, cattle, leaves, or even the sun. Instead, this is a metaphoric pool and what's been termed a symbol of transformation. Narcissus gazes into the pool and becomes entranced by the beauty that the pool is reflecting. What he sees seems so beautiful that he doesn't identify with it at first. He takes himself to be something other than this beauty, and thus assumes this beauty must belong to somebody else. He tries to hug the beautiful image, but he finds it ungraspable and only manages to get his hands wet. Then he enters a confused soliloquy where he wonders about the experience he's having. Is he the lover or the beloved? And finally, this depth vision leads to his death. Narcissus then morphs into a flower, the narcissus flower growing by the side of the pool, that now and forever will bear his name. Clearly, there's no single correct way to interpret any myth, for this would amount to mythological fundamentalism. For anything involving consciousness or culture, myth, religion, politics, or even science, will tend to be interpreted in the way most syntonic with the worldview or developmental level of our particular meme. Hence, the myth of Narcissus and Echo has most commonly been viewed as a cautionary moral tale about the dangers of self-love. Though in truth, throughout most of his life, Narcissus has never loved anyone and has had trouble recognizing his own deeper nature, let alone loving it. And so, a deeper reading of the story would be to see it as a myth of transformation, the archetypal story of a man who transforms from whom he had taken himself to be, and a story that reflects a few pivotal things that would be evocative for the transformation of narcissism. First, like narcissism itself, Narcissus is initially dissociated from the beauty of his own deeper nature, and so he's precluded from recognizing or loving that beauty dwelling in anyone else. Secondly, that he dies by the end of his depth vision, we must assume, from what Tiresias previously told us, that some form of self-knowledge took place. A self-knowledge that was deadly to whom he previously took himself to be. And from this, we might also consider that self-knowledge is deadly to narcissism. Yet since, collectively, narcissism is still very much alive today, a certain kind of self-knowledge has been missing. Various traditions have devised similar gazes that transform the customary perspective of the ego. Dzogchen's sky gazing is one of my favorites, though it is optimally introduced by a facilitator possessing a measure of self-realization and practitioners with a prior sufficient grounding in meditation. Here, you mingle the spaciousness of your own mind with the spaciousness of the sky, and then rest in that spaciousness, the spaciousness that exists in between and prior to each of our thoughts. Here, as in most form of shamatha practice, most forms of meditation, the intent is really to extend the amount of time that we abide in this contentless spaciousness, or what Buddhism refers to as shunyata. This particular practice is central in Vajrayana Buddhism's initiatory nature of mind teachings, where it is pointed out that this contentless unconfined spaciousness, is the first of the three components of Rigpa, the mind's essential nature. The second component of Rigpa is an unconfined capacity for cognitions. And the third component of Rigpa is the indivisible unity of the first two. Here, what's elegantly pointed out is that the mind's spaciousness and its capacity for knowingness are like the two wings of a single bird. For recognizing these indivisible components serve to restore a primordial, pre-existing, unfabricated awareness. In the non-dual traditions, this type of teaching is termed a direct pointing out of the mind's essential nature. There's nothing like it in Western psychology, which is primarily a psychology of the ego and its differentiated forms of psychopathology. And even in Vajrayana Buddhism, such a direct pointing out of the mind's essential nature is seldom offered to those who lack sufficient preparatory training, which traditionally would consist of 100,000 repetitions of numerous preliminary practices. For it is thought that without adequate preparatory training and practice, the seeds of such teaching are unlikely to sprout, which is reminiscent of Jesus' teaching about casting pearls before swine, that is, not offering something valuable to someone who does not understand its value. Another of my favorite gazes is one where the gazing medium is neither a pool of water nor the sky, but instead the left eye of a partner. This gaze, termed traspasso, involves bringing the mind to a one-pointed attention on your partner's left eye, such that you let go of everything else, all your past history with that person, your stories or judgments of them. But this one-pointed awareness also involves relinquishing all your past assumptions about yourself. This meditative gaze is one of the few that I know of that is done in an interpersonal dyad, and that can lead both partners to enter a spacious and knowing presence. I've thus found it useful in doing transpersonal couples therapy, as it can give couples, quite literally, another way of looking at each other, and an alternative way of experiencing oneself, one free of all prior conceptual baggage. Narcissism is the absence of this spacious knowing presence, and so something always feels missing. Thus, when we're in the grips of narcissism, we often attempt to fill that deficient emptiness with what has been termed narcissistic supplies. But the only thing that can truly fill that existential emptiness is the fullness of our own presence, which is never not potentially available. We might be well advised to post a reminder of this on the doorposts of our house. Don't leave home without it. Since narcissism is in part a social disease, and one that is socially spread, it also helps to socially distance by taking periodic retreats into nature. This is something human beings have done for millennia, such as going off into the mountains or the desert in order to reconnect with our own deeper nature. And in a like vein, today, it helps to take periodic breaks from social media, television, newspapers, and radio, for in the main, they too are dissociated from, and thus fail to reflect our deeper nature. It also helps to have spiritual friends, and to enter or create communities that recognize and support authentic beingness, what Buddhism refers to as the Sangha. And since one of the central features of narcissism is the lack of empathy, anything that promotes empathy is good. To this end, it can be good to have a pet, or plants that we care for. Parenthetically, Gurdjieff was once asked by a woman how she could learn to have more loving relationships with other people, and his answer was, start with plants and animals, they're easier. For your dog can't take himself to the vet or buy his own kibble. So the empathic ability to put yourself into your dog's paws, as it were, can help you to know what your dog is saying when it barks, or what your plants are saying when they wilt or thrive. There are also a couple of related skills that we might take from modern psychology. Empathic listening and mirroring. For example, when we're in a conversation that has an emotionally charged topic, it's good to practice empathic listening. Here, the emphasis is on trying to really hear what the other is saying without offering an immediate rebuttal or advice. An emotionally wise woman I knew once taught me to do this, and that it could be as simple as just making an emotionally empathic sound in my throat or chest, at the proper moments in her narrative, to say, oh, like that. Or you could just reflect the important parts of what has been said to you while adding how you'd feel if in the other's shoes. Then you might ask the other if you actually heard what they were trying to convey, and if not, you apologize and have the humility to ask, what part did I miss? Empathic listening can open or refresh the communication channel when it's gotten clogged by arrogance or other forms of debris. Mirroring is quite similar and a go-to move for therapists, in that you track and echo what the other is saying such that they feel their inner experience is being understood and reflected. Both empathic listening and mirroring give you a starting point where you're both on the same page, and thus make it more possible to proceed from there. Feeling truly heard or seen is actually fairly rare and quite healing, and maybe more important than whether someone agrees with our point of view. For feeling gotten was often missing for many of us in our formative years, and we may still bear some wounding from that. Being heard may be more important for Echo. Being seen may be for Narcissus, and both of these figures live within us. Most of the practices found in the spiritual traditions are, in a sense, anti-narcissism training. Yet, without having to get too esoteric, being a good parent, where you put your own needs aside in order to care for a child, is anti-narcissism training. And being a single parent may be advanced training. The marriage vow, to accept a partner for better or worse, is anti-narcissism training. For narcissism often has an eye peeled for a more ideal partner, and ideals turn their noses up toward what's real. Apparently, Narcissus was quite handsome, such that even as a child he inspired others to thoughts of love. Yet he bonds with no one, devalues his lovers, and leaves a trail of broken hearts behind. This led one of his jilted lovers to cast a prayer to highest heaven, asking that Narcissus's fate would be to love only himself, and yet to fail even in that love. And this prayer, a curse really, was heard by wakeful nemesis. And so, valuing others and being generous toward them is anti-narcissism training. Being a good friend is anti-narcissism training, and being willing to walk the extra mile in support of them. It is said that bodhisattvas don't give up on people, and so not ghosting others is anti-narcissism training. Volunteer work is too, or anything we can do to help our communities, our nation, our planet, and widen our sense of empathic inclusivity, the sense that we're all in this together, this incomprehensibly vast thing that we call life. Since hubris was thought to be promulgated by those lacking a knowledge of history, it is good to study history. In fact, healing processes often begin by taking a history. Here in these videos, as well as in my book, I've attempted to take and provide a historical view of narcissism, It's good to know what has and what hasn't worked and in the past, because it provides perspective. And deeper perspective is gained when we manage to keep one of our feet firmly grounded in time and its deadlines, and the other foot grounded in timeless eternity. Our beingness is the eternal part. Yet we might find our deepest integrity when we remain faithful to both, and are informed by both, or as the Sufis say, trust in God but tether your camel. Letting go of our cases against others is anti-narcissism training. Being ethical is good, as is being honest, telling the truth, confessing our failures. These healing traits don't require a guru or an advanced degree, yet when I think of America's 45th president, I'm reminded of a Sufi saying that also helps: learn to behave from one who does not. A little humility is seldom a bad move, and moral humility begins from better recognizing that there are valid reasons why other people believe what they do and why they may not agree with you. And it's skillful to take the trouble of understanding what these reasons are and decide with the ones that are true. Regardless of our religious affiliation, and even if we're atheists, it's helpful to realize that many of the precepts and virtues touted in other religions are good medicine, like the Buddhist paramitas that highlight traits such as generosity, mindfulness, and right livelihood, or the golden rule found in most religions, that of doing unto others what you'd have do unto you. And for those who know the Enneagram, what they know is generally only the Enneagram of the personality, which is an Enneagram of fixations, but is also helpful to check out the Enneagram of the virtues, especially the one that applies to your particular personality style. This Enneagram highlights what is often missing in each of us when we're operating from our fixations. Knowing this is good medicine, a form of self-knowledge that will never be packaged into a vaccine. And though it can seem a bit rarefied, esoteric, and hard to comprehend at first, much like the pointing out offered by the non-dual traditions, the same is true for the most profound Enneagram of all, the Enneagram of the holy ideas. Sometimes it's called the Enneagram of the psychocatalysts, which presents a view of the world quite alien to the ego. In fact, to better understand what narcissism really is, it helps to have a better view of its complete opposite, a model not based on pathology but optimal mental health. And here the spiritual traditions have something to offer modern psychology, something that could help heal from the deficits of its early divorce. For 100 years now, we've been in need of a better dialogue between modern psychology and the world's spiritual traditions. Such a conversation could lead each of them to become freshly infused by what botanists call hybrid vigor. But unfortunately, our inner echo isn't so great at initiating a dialogue. In the myth of Narcissus and Echo, we are told that Echo lives at the effect of a curse. For Echo had tried to distract the goddess Hera with long stories, while Hera's husband Zeus was engaged in having affairs. For this, Hera caused Echo to lose part of her voice. Henceforth, she couldn't initiate conversations, but only echo the last words of what somebody else has already said. When Narcissus spurns her, she can't initiate a conversation with him about this. Instead, feeling shamed, she retreats into lonely valleys and forest caves. When individuals have lost part of their voice, they may be suffering an echo complex. And if they've been molested, raped, or physically abused, it may take years or even decades before they emerge from their shamed, lonely caves and speak out. We've seen this quite poignantly recently in the Me Too movement. Narcissus himself is the offspring of a rapist, for he was conceived when his mother, Lierpe, was once encircled by the winding streams of the river god Cephisus, who caught and raped her until she almost drowned. Apparently, Narcissus took after his father, an entitled figure without empathy who takes what he wants and flows on. As a psychologist, I much respect Dr. James Masterson, one of modern psychology's leading authorities on narcissism, and a proponent of mirroring interventions in treating it. The capacity to mirror clients suffering from narcissism is pivotal, it is thought, because their deeper nature was generally not adequately seen or supported by parents who were often themselves narcissistic. And when a child's deeper qualities remain unseen and inadequately mirrored, we can become dissociated from them and grow up oblivious to our own deeper nature. Though the Diagnostic Manual of American Psychiatry makes no mention of different narcissistic styles, of the four that Masterson recognized, the one most often showing up in my consulting room is what he termed closet narcissism. Unlike Erich Fromm and Otto Kernberg, Masterson didn't recognize narcissism's fifth and most pernicious style, malignant narcissism. Perhaps this was because malignant narcissism almost never shows up for therapy unless mandated by the legal system, or perhaps because malignant narcissism and psychopaths are one and the same. In my view, psychopaths are always narcissistic, for they feel entitled and lack empathy to a truly malignant degree. But not all narcissists are malignantly psychopathic, for if this were the case, the planet Earth would now be a hell realm, and humans hell-bent and doomed to an inevitable extinction. Closet narcissists seem in a closet due to their fear of exposure and how anxiously uncertain they become of the outer world's capacity to receive and support them. They're afraid they'd be attacked or shamed if they came out of the closet, for in some way that had already happened to them earlier in life when their own essential nature wasn't adequately recognized, valued, and mirrored. And the figure of Echo, sheltering in her lonely valleys and forest caves, may be closet narcissism's paradigmatic figure. Culturally, Echo also shows up today when political groups can only echo the words of their leaders, and they wind up in the cave-like echo chamber of cults. We've seen this recently in one of America's political parties, when it's only able to echo the delusional conspiracy theories of a narcissistic president, and when countering these cultic beliefs has led to reprisals and the fear of being ostracized from the party and cast into a lonely political cave. But also where servitude to the cult leader and to remaining in power and the good graces of the party's donor class out-prioritize an empathy for the true needs of the American people as well as toward the rest of the planet. Something similar can be seen in psychological and spiritual groups when they too become tribally ethnocentric, or when in the guise of doctrinal purity they refuse to adequately weigh in on the issues of our time, and so can't initiate the healing conversations that they and our world are needing to have. But when this is the case, we, the people, need to exercise our own psychological and spiritual authority, first and foremost by revisioning, recognizing, and healing the narcissism within ourselves. Ovid's version of the myth of Narcissus and Echo suggests that this involves a metaphorical death to whom we previously taken ourselves to be. Then we might become more intimate with the ground of being, like that flower Narcissus morphs into at the end of his myth. Ultimately, this is a grateful death, for only then can we fully embody narcissism's complete opposite. Yet given all that narcissism impacts today, the lack of empathy in our interpersonal relationships, our domestic politics, international relations, and a stalled capacity to respond to pandemics or the urgencies of global warming, given all that, its healing can't remain a concern only of the few. For though a healthy stage in young children, when it persists into adulthood, narcissism's egocentricity is a form of developmental arrest, as is the polarized, tribal ethnocentricity of our culture wars. Narcissism's egocentricity and the ethnocentricity of tribal warfare have darkened the human landscape forever. What's distinctive about our time is that healing and evolving beyond both is now a planetary and evolutionary imperative. For healing and evolving beyond both, when aided by scientific guidance, just might allow the only planet we have to heal itself. And so, descending into the darkness of an apocalyptic midnight needn't be our fate. As the minstrel once sang, so let us not speak falsely now, the hour is getting late.